Native woman took a cooking job for the Cowboys on a ranch, not knowing that would change her life. The wind over Red Wind Basin cut like a hot blade, dragging the scent of scorched iron across the land. The ground beneath Dry Creek Ranch had split wide, the cracks deep as scars on a weathered soul. Jed Rowan stood on the porch, hat low, watching the sun bleed into the red hills. The men were gone. The cattle were bone-thin shadows. Even the well had given up. Only the wind stayed, whispering like a warning. Then footsteps. Through the drifting dust came a woman, Apache, small, steady, wrapped in a sun-bleached shawl, her eyes bright as copper fire. She crossed the yard without fear, knelt beside the cold ashes of a dead fire, and said quietly, "I can make it live again." Jed didn't answer. He just stared at her hands, rough, calm, certain, and for the first time in a long while, he believed the land might breathe once more. Summer of 1882, in the far reaches of Red Wind Basin, Arizona territory. The basin stretched wide and bare, hemmed in by ridges the color of rusted blood. Heat shimmered like ghosts over the plain. Nothing truly lived here anymore, just wind, dust, and the echo of cattle that once filled the valley. Each dawn began in silence, and each dusk ended with the sky burning itself out. At the edge of that silence stood Dry Creek Ranch, half alive and half ruined. The barn leaned like an old drunk. The corral posts sagged. And the well Jed's last hope had turned to mud weeks ago. Yet Jed Rowan stayed. He was not a man who fled what had once belonged to his father. The sun had darkened his skin. The years had carved lines around his eyes. There was a steadiness to him, the sort that came from losing nearly everything and still finding work to do at dawn. His right hand bore a pale scar, a memory of a fire long ago that took more than just flesh. That afternoon, when the stranger came, he'd been repairing a broken hinge on the stable door. He turned when he heard her voice, a low, even tone that didn't ask permission. Now, in the wavering light, he saw her more clearly. She was Etsa, though she didn't offer her name yet. Apache by blood, perhaps in her late 20s, lean from travel, her hair, black and tangled from wind, caught the sunlight like a river of coal dust. A single turquoise stone hung from a leather cord at her throat, cracked but polished by time. Her clothes were patched, but clean, her boots worn thin at the soles. There was something in the way she carried herself, a mix of fatigue and unyielding pride. Jed noticed the way she looked around the yard, not with fear, but with memory, as if she recognized every plant and patch of dry earth. When she finally met his eyes, her gaze held steady, and he saw a kind of fire he'd only seen once before in his mother's eyes, the day she refused to leave during the great drought. "I cook," she said simply. "Trade me a corner to sleep and a bucket of water." Jed hesitated. The men in town had spoken of Apache raids, of women who stole as scouts for their tribes. But this woman's hands weren't made for deceit. They were made for survival. He nodded once, slow. "If you can keep a fire lit in this wind," he said, "you can stay." As she moved toward the cookhouse, the smell of dust mixed with the faint sweetness of sage crushed under her heel. The wind shifted, and for the first time that month, Jed thought he smelled rain. The cookhouse crouched behind the barn, half buried in sand. Its windows were black with soot, and the air inside smelled of old grease and mouse nests. Etsa pushed the door open with her shoulder, sending a cloud of dust spinning into the light. A single stove stood in the corner, iron door cracked, ash spilling down its legs like gray snow. Behind her, Jed stopped at the doorway. "It's been cold, a long while," he said. She didn't answer. She crouched near the stove, ran her fingers along the dented surface, then nodded once. "It still remembers heat." Her calm unsettled him. Women who came to the ranch, when they came at all, were either desperate or broken. This one was neither. He watched as she emptied her bag, a dented tin cup, a skinning knife, a bundle of dried herbs tied with horsehair. "There's a barrel behind the bunkhouse," he said. "Water's low. Don't waste it." Etza turned, eyes glinting. "I don't waste anything." That evening, smoke began to rise from the cookhouse chimney, thin at first, then stronger, sweeter. The scent drifted across the yard, and the men who'd stayed on through the drought looked up from their work. They followed it like hungry dogs to the open door, where Jed stood with his arms folded. Inside, Etza moved quietly between the stove and the work table. She stirred a pot of beans over coals she'd coaxed from what had seemed like dead ash, mixing in bits of jerky, salt, and something green that made the air smell like rain on dry rock. When one of the men muttered, "Hell, I didn't think Apache could cook," Jed shot him a look that cut the sound short. They ate standing up, bent over their tin plates. No one spoke, though a few nodded once or twice, as if admitting something they didn't want to say aloud. Jed didn't eat. He just watched her. The way she tasted her broth with the tip of a wooden spoon. The way she wiped the rim of the pot with her sleeve before ladling more out. Everything she did had purpose. When the last man drifted off, Etza began cleaning. Jed stepped forward. "Leave it. You've done enough." Her hands didn't stop. "The fire should die clean," she said. "Else it burns wrong next time." He leaned on the doorframe. "You talk like fire's a person." She glanced up. "It is. To those who've learned respect." Outside, the wind picked up, blowing dust against the wall. For a long while, they listened to it without speaking. "You got a place you're heading?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nowhere that's left." He wanted to ask more what she'd lost, how she'd come to be alone, but the words wouldn't come. Her silence wasn't the kind that invited comfort. It was the kind that kept a person alive. When he finally turned to leave, she said quietly, "You shouldn't stand too close to the door." He paused. "Why's that?" "The wind steals heat," she replied, and stirred the pot again. That night, from the bunkhouse, Jed could see the thin column of smoke rising from her stove. It glowed faintly against the stars. A promise or a warning, he couldn't tell which. All he knew was that, for the first time in months, Dry Creek smelled like food instead of dust. And somewhere in that stillness, he realized the land wasn't the only thing trying to come back to life. Morning came slow and amber, the kind of light that burned off the chill, but not the doubt. Jed woke to the sound of a knife hitting wood steady, unhurried. From the porch, he saw Etza behind the cookhouse, slicing strips of dried meat. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic. Every slice looked deliberate, every breath measured. He called over. "You been up long." "Since the fire," she said without looking up. "It doesn't wait for anyone." He wasn't sure whether she meant the sun or herself. That day, the men rode out to check the herd, leaving the ranch quiet. Jed spent the morning fixing a fence post, hammer echoing against the still air. He noticed her from time to time hauling water from the half-dead well, washing pans with dust when there wasn't enough to rinse them. She worked like the land patient, stubborn and impossibly alive in the wrong season. By noon, the heat turned cruel. He saw her pause near the trough, sweat glistening on her temple. Without a word, he filled a tin cup and held it out. She hesitated, Eyes on him, cautious but not afraid, then took it, drank once, and handed it back. "You don't trust easy," he said. "I've learned not to." "From who?" She set the cup down gently. "From everyone who promised water and gave me dust." There was no reply to that. He just nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. The days turned to a rhythm. She cooked. He repaired. And somehow their silences began to fit together. He noticed how she hummed quietly when she stirred the pot, how she walked barefoot in the evenings, saying the ground could read a person better that way. Once, when a sudden gust sent sparks from the stove, Jed reached out to shield her face. Her hand met his halfway, pressing against his wrist, grounding him. The moment passed in the heartbeat between instinct and realization. Later that week, she approached him as he fixed the roof above the corral. "The cattle are thirsty," she said. "They always are," he replied. "But there's a place," she continued, "up beyond the ridge. The old ones called it whispering water. It might still flow under the rocks." He stared down at her, squinting against the sun. "That's Apache land. Men around here think it's cursed." Her gaze didn't waver. "Men around here don't know the difference between curse and consequence." The next morning, before dawn, they rode out together. The horses moved slow through the pale light, the basin still cool before the heat took hold. Etza led, quiet but sure. She read the land like scripture, the tilt of grass, the flight of ravens, the faint scent of damp earth buried under dust. By midday, the wind rose, lifting a curtain of sand that turned the world copper. They wrapped scarves over their mouths, eyes stinging. When Jed's horse stumbled, Etza reached back, caught his reins, and shouted through the roar, "Follow the rocks. They don't move even when the sky does." They found shelter under a narrow overhang, pressed shoulder to shoulder as the storm raged outside. The space was small, the air thick with dust and the smell of sweat and iron. Jed could feel her heartbeat against his sleeve, quick but steady. "You've done this before," he said. She nodded. "Storms don't frighten me." "What does?" Her eyes lifted to his dark, glinting with something softer than defiance. "Men who forget what the earth gives and what it can take." He didn't know if she meant him, but he couldn't look away. When the wind finally died, the silence between them was heavier than the sand that covered their boots. They found the spring that evening, a trickle running beneath a tangle of roots, cold and clean. Etza knelt beside it, cupped the water in her hands, and smiled small, rare, but real. "See," she whispered, "the earth remembers kindness." Jed crouched beside her, watching the water run through her fingers. For the first time, he reached out, not to help, not to command, just to feel the same water she did. The touch of her hand against his was brief, accidental, but it burned longer than the sun. When they returned to Dry Creek, the men didn't ask where they'd gone, only why they'd come back smiling. That night, as she poured him coffee, stronger than sin, Etza said softly, "You found what you were looking for." He met her eyes across the rising steam. "I think I did." Outside, the basin was quiet. The wind that once screamed now only sighed through the dry grass. Inside the cookhouse, 2 fires burned, one on the stove, and one neither dared to name. The days after they found water brought something close to peace. The troughs filled again. The cattle grazed on dry shoots turning green, and the men began to laugh without guilt. For the first time since spring, Dry Creek Ranch smelled of life instead of dust. But peace, Etza knew, never stayed long in places like Redwind Basin. It began with a rider, Red Callahan, young and loud, returned from the town of Red Bluff Crossing with supplies, whiskey, and poison in his tongue. At supper, as Etsa ladled stew into tin bowls, he leaned back on his chair and said, "Ain't it something, a woman like her running a white man's kitchen?" His grin flashed under the lantern light. "Heard some say she worked at Fort Lowell once, back when the soldiers needed comfort." The room went still. Forks froze. Spoons clattered. Etsa didn't look up. Her hands kept moving, calm as ever. Only Jed spoke, voice low. "You talk too much when you drink." Red smirked, just repeating what folks already know. Jed stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. The men backed off as he crossed the room in 2 strides. His fist met Red's jaw with a crack that echoed louder than thunder. Red hit the dirt outside, spitting blood in surprise. Jed towered over him, breathing hard. "You ever speak her name again, you'll eat through a straw the rest of your days." No one laughed. Not one man in that room doubted he meant it. That night, Jed didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring at the horizon where the sky met the desert, wondering when decency had become a thing a man had to defend with his fists. When Etsa came out before dawn, she didn't thank him. She didn't have to. She handed him a tin cup of coffee and said, "You hurt your hand. It's nothing. You should still wash it." He nodded but didn't move. She sat beside him. The silence between them was soft, like the space between breaths. But calm is fragile in a land built on hunger. That afternoon, a storm brewed from the south, thunder without rain. The wind rose, pulling sparks from the forge near the barn. Someone shouted. Within moments, the hay caught, fire leaping high in the dry air. "Get the cattle out!" Jed bellowed. Men ran, shouting orders drowned by the roar. Etsa was still inside the cookhouse when the flames jumped the fence. Smoke rolled under the door, black and thick. She tried the latch jammed. Outside, she heard Jed yelling her name. He tore through the smoke, arm raised to shield his face. "Etsa, I'm here." He found her crouched beside the stove, soaked a rag in the last bucket of water, and pressed it to her mouth. The roof groaned above them. Jed threw his coat over her shoulders, grabbed her around the waist, and ran. The heat clawed at his back. Sparks bit into his shirt. As they stumbled into the open, the roof caved in behind them with a scream of timber. He dropped to his knees, holding her tight against him, both coughing, gasping. "You all right?" She nodded weakly. Her face was streaked with soot, eyes bright through the tears the smoke forced out. "You're burned. Doesn't matter." She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You shouldn't keep trying to save me." He managed a faint, broken laugh, then stopped needing saving. She pressed a hand to his cheek, his skin hot, blistering. "I didn't need it," she whispered, "but I'm glad you did it anyway." When the fire finally died, the ranch lay half in ruin. The barn was gone, the cookhouse a black shell. Only the stone well still stood, defiant against the smoke. That night, while the men slept on the ground, Jed sat by the ashes. Etsa approached quietly, wrapped in a blanket. She knelt beside him, holding something in her hand, her turquoise pendant. The cord burned through. It broke. She said simply. He reached for it, then stopped. "I can fix it." She shook her head. "Some things aren't meant to go back the way they were." He looked at her, eyes tired but steady. "Then we make them different." She hesitated, then handed him the smaller piece. "Keep it, then, so you don't forget the fire." He closed his hand around the fragment, feeling its coolness against his blistered skin. "I won't." behind them. Dawn began to rise, faint light pushing through the smoke, painting the land in red and gold. The air still smelled of ash and rain that hadn't fallen. Etsa said quietly, "You fought a man for me. You ran through fire for me. What happens when the next storm comes?" Jed turned to her, voice rough. "Then we fight it together." For a moment, neither moved. The wind whispered through the blackened posts, lifting the ash into small spirals that looked almost like ghosts. She watched them twist away into the light, then said, "Maybe this land just needed to burn once more before it could live." He looked at her, at the soot on her face, the streaks of copper in her hair, and realized she wasn't talking about the land at all. The fire left behind a silence that no one dared to break. For days, the air around Dry Creek Ranch hung heavy with the smell of smoke and wet earth. The men spoke in whispers, patching fences with eyes lowered, as if afraid that any loud word might summon the flames again. Jed Rowan worked from dawn till nightfall, his burned hand wrapped in cloth. He rebuilt the corral, repaired the windmill blades, dug new troughs with blistered fingers. It wasn't duty anymore, it was defiance. He couldn't save everything, but what he saved, he would save completely. When the nights came, he slept by the well. Etsa kept her distance at first, helping the few men who stayed to cook what little food was left. She didn't ask him to rest, and he didn't ask her to forgive. Both understood that words, once spoken too early, carried more burden than truth. On the third evening, she brought him a bowl of stew and set it beside his boot. "You'll break yourself this way," she said. Jed didn't look up. "Maybe that's what it takes." "You think pain earns you back the land?" He finally raised his head. In the lamplight, the bandage around his wrist was dark with sweat and dirt. "No," he said quietly, "but it earns me a right to stand on it." Etsa didn't reply. She sat beside him, the dust rising faintly as her dress brushed the ground. The moon was thin, hanging like a blade above the basin. "Crickets sang somewhere beyond the broken barn," she said, after a long silence. "When I was a child, my mother told me every fire leaves something behind, not just ash, something smaller, a seed that waits for the next rain." Jed turned the turquoise fragment over in his palm. Maybe she was right. Etsa looked at his hand, at the stone half she'd given him. "I thought you'd throw that away." "I tried," he admitted. "Couldn't." She smiled faintly. "Then you're learning." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage from the far ridge, a clean, green smell that didn't belong to this broken valley. It filled the space between them. "Etsa," he said slowly, "when that barn went up, I thought I'd lost you." "You didn't," she murmured. "You found me where you least expected, in the fire you feared most." He stared at her, and she met his gaze. For the first time, there was no wall, no suspicion, no silence too wide to cross. She reached for his bandaged hand and began to unwrap it carefully. The burn beneath was raw, the skin reddened and tender. She soaked a cloth in the cool well water, then laid it across his palm. Her fingers lingered light, deliberate. Jed inhaled sharply. "You don't have to." "I know." Her voice softened. "But I want to." He looked down at their hands, hers, dark and strong. His rough and scarred, and the sight did something to him. It wasn't desire exactly, it was recognition. Two people shaped by loss, each carrying the weight of something they refused to name. After a while, she said, "Why do you stay here?" Jed Rowan. "You could have left long ago, because leaving means I'd lose what little of my father still lives in this dirt." He hesitated. I told myself I was keeping the ranch for him, but maybe I was just afraid to admit it's mine now. The mistakes, the fires, the rebuilding, all of it. She nodded slowly. Then it's time to stop being your father's son and become what her eyes flicked up to his. Steady and bright. A man who chooses what kind of land he'll stand on and who he'll stand with. Jed swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. Would you stay if I asked you? Etsa's smile was small, but it reached her eyes. You've never had to ask. The next morning brought thin rain. It fell in a whisper, barely wetting the ground, but the smell of it was enough to stir hope. The men worked faster, spirits lifted by the thought that maybe, just maybe, the basin hadn't given up on them. Jed found Etsa near the cookhouse, repairing the stove door with a piece of salvaged iron. You mean to bring that thing back to life? He asked. She looked up. Soot streaked across her cheek. You mean to rebuild the barn? He laughed softly. Fair. He walked closer, watching her fit the hinge back into place. You don't owe this place anything, he said. She didn't stop working. No. But I owe myself the proof that I can stay somewhere without running. He stepped behind her, close enough that his shadow fell over her hands. Then stay here, he said quietly. Stay where the fire burned and didn't win. Etsa's movement stilled. She set down the hammer, turned to face him. If I stay, she said, this can't just be your land anymore. It won't be, he said. It'll be ours. Her expression didn't soften right away. She searched his face for hesitation and found none. Finally, she nodded. Then you'd better learn to eat the way I cook. Jed grinned, a sound like relief escaping him. Deal. Later that night, after the rain ended, they sat beneath the half-rebuilt awning of the barn. The air was cool, damp, alive. Jed reached into his pocket and took out the turquoise fragment. It gleamed faintly in the lantern light. I never asked what this meant, he said. Etsa took it from him, holding it up to the flame. My mother said turquoise carries the memory of water. It keeps your spirit from turning to stone. She looked at him then. Maybe it's time we put it back together. He watched as she pulled a thin leather cord from her wrist and threaded the broken halves side by side, not mended into one, but bound together, each piece visible, each scar intact. She tied it loosely around her neck. That's how things last, she said, not by forgetting what broke them. He nodded, eyes on the necklace. Then maybe that's how we last too. Outside, the basin breathed. Somewhere, out beyond the ridge, frogs began to sing a sound the valley hadn't heard in years. Etsa leaned against his shoulder, her voice low. The land's remembering how to live again. Jed's hand found hers. So are we. And as the stars climbed over Redwind Basin, the fire they'd built small, steady, stubborn, burned through the dark, without smoke, without fear, without end. A full year passed before Redwind Basin dared to call itself alive again. By the summer of 1883, green grass cut through the dust like veins of hope. The rebuilt barn stood firm, its new boards pale against the older, charred ones Jed had refused to replace. Leave them, he'd said. So the place remembers. Dry Creek Ranch was no longer quiet. The windmill creaked with purpose. Horses stamped in the yard, and laughter returned with the morning chores. Jed's shoulders had broadened from labor, his skin tanned deep by sun and wind. There was something different in his eyes now, not the weariness of a man waiting for ruin, but the steady calm of someone who had chosen to build despite it. At the center of it all was Etsa. She'd taken charge of the cookhouse again, its chimney smoke rising straight as prayer into the clear sky. The men, once cautious, now trusted her as they trusted rain, something rare, but real when it came. She taught them how to ration wood, how to keep a stove breathing through the hottest months, and when she smiled, even the silence seemed less heavy. Each dawn, Jed came by her door. Sometimes he brought repairs, sometimes nothing at all. They didn't need reasons anymore. They'd built their peace like they'd rebuilt the ranch, plank by plank, word by word, mistake by mistake. One evening, when the horizon burned orange and violet, Etza stood outside with her hands dusted in flour. The smell of bread drifted through the air. Jed walked up behind her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Smells better than any summer I can remember." She half turned, teasing, "You remember many enough to know this one's worth keeping." Her laughter was soft. Carried away by the wind, she gestured toward the hills, where the grass rippled under the fading light. "You did it, Jed Rowan. You made the land stay." He shook his head. "No, we did." They watched as a storm brewed far off, not a dry one, but the good kind, the kind that smelled of wet soil and forgiveness. Lightning flared behind the clouds, tracing silver veins through the sky. The air trembled with promise. When the first drops began to fall, the men ran for cover, shouting and laughing. Etza stayed where she was, arms open, face tilted to the rain. Jed stepped beside her. "You'll catch cold," he said, though he didn't move either. She looked up, rain streaking her cheeks like tears she didn't owe anyone. "Let it come. We've waited long enough." The downpour came heavy, beating against the roof, hissing in the dirt. It ran over the ashes still buried near the barn and pooled into the trenches Jed had dug for the crops. Water found its way home, under the awning. Etza's turquoise pendant gleamed against her throat, two pieces bound together, catching every flash of light. Jed reached out, his hand brushing the edge of the stone. Still holding, he asked, "It remembers the fire," she said, "and the hands that carried it through." He smiled, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Then maybe it remembers us." For a moment, they stood in the doorway, framed by storm and firelight, two figures carved out of everything the basin had taken and given back. Behind them, the new sign Jed had hung above the gate swayed in the wind, Dry Creek Ranch, kept alive by two fires. When the rain eased, the sky broke open to a deep indigo. Stars scattered above the wet fields, brighter than they'd ever been. The men returned to their bunks, leaving the ranch wrapped in quiet once more. Jed and Etza walked out to the edge of the pasture. The grass glistened, the earth steaming faintly. In the distance, frogs croaked, coyotes answered. Life had returned in voices. He stopped by the well, the same well that had once stood useless and dry, and leaned against its rim. "I used to hate the sound of wind here," he said. "It meant emptiness." Etza traced the worn stone with her fingers. "And now it sounds like a heartbeat." She nodded, understanding more than the words. The wind lifted her hair, brushing it against his shoulder. This place, it was never cursed. It was just waiting for someone stubborn enough to listen. He laughed, a low, genuine sound. "Then I guess we were both cursed to stay, to keep trying." Etza's smile was quiet, her gaze drifting to the stars. Some curses are just old prayers that finally got answered. He took her hand, callous fingers intertwining with hers. The contact was simple, steady, not a promise of forever, but proof of presence. After a while, he said, "My father would have liked you." "Maybe," she said, "but I think he would have liked who you became more." They stood like that, letting the night settle around them. The ranch creaked softly, alive with the small noises of things rebuilding, the groan of wood drying, the drip of water from the eaves, the breath of horses in their stalls. Every sound was a reminder nothing perfect ever lasts, but sometimes what survives is enough. As dawn neared, a faint red light climbed over the ridge. Etsa released his hand and stepped forward, her feet sinking into the damp earth. She bent down, scooped a handful of soil, and held it open to the wind. The dirt slipped through her fingers, glimmering in the new light. "See," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It lives." Jed joined her, his palm covering hers, both of them watching the last specks fall back to the ground. "So do we," he said. The wind shifted again, warmer this time, carrying the scent of rain and baked bread from the cookhouse. A single column of smoke rose from its chimney. Pale against the sky, the kind of smoke that spoke not of burning, but of home. And in that morning light, the two fires that had remade Red Wind Basin, one born of earth, the other of heart, kept burning quietly, side by side. In every story we tell from the Wild West, it isn't just about guns, dust, or broken dreams. It's about the people who kept going when the land itself tried to stop them. Jed Rowan and Etsa remind us that hope doesn't roar, it flickers, small and steady, in the hands of those who refuse to let it die. If this story moved you, remember we share tales like this every day, stories of grit, grace, and love that outlast the storms. Stay with us and keep the fire alive, one story at a time.